My name is Philip Vaughan. I'm a painter, sculptor, and I draw with charcoal and pastels on paper. I'm showing with Alov Arts at the 2025 LA Art Fair, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I was born in England, but we moved as a family to France when I was about a year old. But my dad had a job in France after the war, so we moved, when I was about a year old, we moved to Le Havre in Normandy. And we lived in a little place called Saint-Andrés on the outskirts of Le Havre. And coincidentally, Claude Monet lived about a block away when he was, I mean, not at the same time, but he was an accountant at the time, or his father wanted him to be an accountant, and he wanted to be a painter, needless to say, and so there was quite an argument between them at the time. Grew up in France, loved France, learned French, went to school there. And it wasn't until I was about 9 years old that my parents decided to send me to English boarding school. One of the amazing things to me was that when I was in the senior school, when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I met Gordon Taylor, who was head of the art department at Brighton College, and he became the first major influence in my life. He taught us how to draw. He taught us the history of architecture in England, the history of European architecture, and painting and sculpture. When I left high school, I went off to study architecture at Cambridge. That's where I met a group of anthropologists and became very enamored with the whole science of anthropology. And while I was there, I decided that really what I wanted to do was become a painter. So I went to Chelsea Art School, or to Hornsey Art School first for a year, and then Chelsea Art School for 3 years, and then later to Newcastle Polytechnic for a couple of years for a postgraduate. So I had a pretty good education in both architecture and painting. And while I was at art school, I met a group of people, including Peter Wynne Wilson, who did a lot of work with projection and kinetics and mechanical devices. So I became quite involved with all of that and developed, while I was at Chelsea Art School, quite a lot of work that would be called kinetic work. And it was involving switching of light and that kind of thing. And towards the end of my stint at Chelsea Art School, I was asked to do a big sculpture for the Hayward Gallery on the south bank of the River Thames. It's the South Bank Arts Centre. And that became a 50-foot high neon sculpture, steel and neon sculpture, that reacted to the weather, to the wind and the wind direction, wind speed, and it stood there for, I think, about 40 years or so. Became quite an icon in South London. While I was at Cambridge studying architecture, I met an anthropologist by the name of Peter Silverwood Cope, and we became very close friends. And he went off and did his initial study in Amazonia. He was a cultural anthropologist, and a few years later he decided to go back to check to see how they were doing in how this tribe, the Maku, that he was studying, were doing. And I went along as we made up as a job for me, which was photographer. So I took pictures of the people, and I was part of his expedition, living in the forest. And that became one of the formative influences in my life. And it was there that I discovered the world of Amazonia, which is really essentially a world of vertical lines. Trees, there are thousands and thousands of trees growing there, and you're all the time you're there, you're surrounded by these trees, and they're going off into the horizon, into the heavens, and you see a world that's become vertical. And this kind of work came from that. It's a world that's defined by these vertical lines, and I started working with these things for a while, and I couldn't really sort of work out where it had come from. And then I realized one day, this is Amazonia, this is the world that we lived in for 3 months. So obviously it was a major influence on my life. When I had graduated from art school, I started doing some teaching, and I taught for 2 or 3 years at Sir John Cass in London. I was always fascinated by the United States, and I think my interest was piqued by people like Robert Rauschenberg and Willem de Kooning and various painters that I really admired. So while I was teaching in art school, this is at the Sir John Cass School in East London, I decided to build a boat. And I had some other friends who were building boats. So we finished up building a boat in Rotherhithe in East London, along the Thames. And I spent about 2 years putting this boat together. They're starting off with a fiberglass hull and deck, and then going from there. And launched the boat in about 1977. And shortly after that, I got married, and my wife was encouraging me to carry on with my life. And so we finished up going together. And eventually, that was the boat that I sailed to the United States across the Atlantic and arrived here in about 1980. Another major influence in my life has been the ocean, and the time I spent out there crossing the Atlantic day and night for 3 months. I fell in love with the ocean and with the surface of the water, which changes all the time. But also, at any one moment, it's a place. And so I became fascinated by the water and the surface of the water under all sorts of different conditions, windy and calm. And that has translated into a fixation, a real fascination on my part with the water surface and the ocean, and generally the environment of the ocean. One of the things about how I approach making things and making artwork is through the process of actually making the work. So when I start out, I often don't have too much of an idea about where I'm going, but I find out where I'm going through the process of actually both either sculpting it in metal or wood or paint or drawing it on paper. The act of making something is the way that I arrive at the final process. Well, I was sort of sitting around in my studio, and somebody called me and said, "You better go outside and have a look." And so I went outside, and I could see this glow on the horizon. That day was very windy. I mean, we were blowing about 80 knots of wind here, and the trees were flying around, and branches were breaking off, trees were falling over, fences were falling over. This is before the fire. I've lived here for probably 30 years or so, and I've seen this before. And this was a forest fire that was growing, that was filling. It was going right from Eaton Canyon, which is down by in the flatlands, right up to the surface, to the peak of the mountains. And this wall of fire was moving here. And so we left, and I left all the artwork that you see here and everything in my drawers, and I realized that it was a good chance that by the time I came back, there would be nothing left. But as it happened, the house was saved and the studio was saved, even though many houses in Altadena were not. And I have a lot of artist friends who lost everything. And I have to say, it's a tragedy for those people. I think it's a really a pivotal moment in my life to realize that all of these things that I normally sort of judge myself by, or they've been milestones in my life, would completely disappear. Opportunity to show with Alov Arts is something that is very dear to me, because for the first time, I think, I have shown all the different kinds of work that I do together. Both drawings, paintings, sculptures, and kinetic work all together. So I think you get a better sense in this show of the range of work that I have and the way these different media interconnect. And I think Alov Arts are the first organization really to have shown the breadth of the work that I have all at one time. So I think it's a really great opportunity for me, and I really appreciate being able to show all this stuff together. My name's Philip Vaughan. I'm a Los Angeles-based artist. I'd like to invite you all to come and see my work at the Alov Arts booth at the LA Art Fair 2025.